Let's talk about something that's become a huge part of our lives: restricting freedom of movement during a health crisis. It's one of the most visible and, let's be honest, controversial things that can happen. So today, we're going to break down the ethical thinking behind these really tough decisions, and we'll be using guidance straight from the World Health Organization. We're going to get into that high-stakes balancing act between keeping the public safe and protecting our personal freedoms. I mean, we've all experienced this in some way, haven't we? Quarantines, lockdowns, travel bans, these things hit right at the core of our personal liberty. So it brings up this massive question. When is it actually justified? When does protecting the whole community actually outweigh our fundamental right to just move around? To get to the bottom of that, we're going to walk through the WHO's ethical roadmap. First, we'll look at the central conflict. Then, we'll dig into the very strict reasons needed for any restriction. After that, we'll talk about the humane conditions that absolutely have to be met, how to protect individual rights, and finally, we'll get into what it takes to build the trust that makes any of this even possible. All right, first up, the ethical balancing act. This is really the heart of the whole dilemma. It's this fundamental tension between the good of the community and the liberty of the individual. Pretty much every other principle we're going to talk about is trying to solve this one problem. And here's why it's such a challenge. On one hand, these measures are justified by a really powerful ethical idea: protecting the health of the entire community. But, and this is a huge but, they also put a massive burden on people by directly limiting fundamental human rights, like our freedom to move and to gather. It's this constant push and pull that has to be managed with incredible care. Okay, so with such a high-stakes balancing act, when is it actually okay to put these restrictions in place? Well, that brings us to our second point, the grounds for restriction. The number one rule, and it's absolutely non-negotiable, is that it has to be based on science. These kinds of restrictions can't be based on fear or politics or just a hunch. You have to have solid evidence-based reason to believe the measure will actually work, that it's really going to cut down on the spread of disease. And if that evidence changes, the restrictions have to be looked at again, and if they're not justified anymore, they have to be lifted immediately. Now that leads right into another key idea: using the least restrictive means. Basically, this means you always have to start with the lightest touch possible. You don't just jump to the most extreme lockdown if a less intense measure could get the job done. Think of it like a ladder of options. You only climb to the next rung when you absolutely have to. And you can see this idea in action when you compare the different approaches. Voluntary cooperation, asking people to isolate if they're sick, is always where you want to start. Public mandates, where things are enforced by law, should really be a last resort. They're only used when you have a strong reason to believe that the voluntary approach just isn't going to be enough to protect public health. Okay, so let's say society does have to restrict someone's freedom for the greater good. What does it owe that person in return? This is a big one. It brings us to Section 3, ensuring humane conditions. The WHO calls this a reciprocal obligation. It's a two-way street. And this isn't just a friendly suggestion, it's an ethical must-do. If you're going to tell someone they can't leave, you have a duty to make sure their basic needs are met. We're talking about the essentials: food, clean water, a safe place to stay, medical care, and a way to talk to family and friends. It also means they have to be protected from harm. And, critically, you have to make sure the place they're being kept isn't actually putting them at a higher risk of getting sick. So beyond those basic human needs, you've got to have formal systems in place to protect people's rights, even in a crisis. So let's dive into Section 4, protecting fundamental rights. This is all about having procedural safeguards and making sure things are equitable. At its heart, due process is just a way to make sure that nobody's freedom is taken away without any recourse. It means people have to have a clear way to challenge the decision, a fair process to get it reviewed, and the right to appeal it. And just as important, the authorities making these calls have to be held accountable. These checks and balances are what stop emergency powers from being abused. And that ties directly into the idea of equity. This quote from the WHO guidance says it all, really. The burden of these restrictions can't fall unfairly on people who are already vulnerable. Think about it. A stay-at-home order can be devastating for someone who has to leave their home just to earn money for food or to get clean water. Fairness has to be baked into the plan from the very start. So we've got science, we've got using the lightest touch possible, humane conditions, and due process. But what's the glue that holds all of this together? Well, that brings us to our final and maybe most important section: the foundation of it all: trust. This is just so incredibly important. Without clear, honest, and constant communication, public trust just disappears. And if you don't have trust, even the most scientifically perfect plans are going to fail. This means really talking with communities, listening to what they're worried about, being transparent about why decisions are being made, and giving regular updates. It's not just a nice to have extra, it's a core part of an ethical response. So there you have it. We've just walked through the WHO's ethical roadmap for one of the hardest calls a public health official can ever make. It sets a really high bar, one that demands a serious commitment to science, human rights, and transparency. And that leaves us with a critical question to think about. What systems do we need to start building in our own communities right now to make sure we're actually ready to meet this ethical standard when the next crisis hits?